Hello, and welcome to today's event. Today, we're very happy to welcome Dr. Alexandre Gandil. Dr. Gandil is a teaching and research fellow at Bordeaux Montaigne University in Bordeaux, and also an associate researcher at CERI, the Center for International Studies at Sciences Po in Paris. And he's here today. He's going to talk a lot about his newly published book, really the definitive history of Kinmen, which just came out very recently from Carthala Press. It's called Kinmen, un archipel entre Taiwan et la Chine, if I haven't completely butchered the pronunciation of the title. So without any further delay, I will turn the floor over to Dr. Gandil to present for as long as he likes about the book. For those in the audience, if you'd like to pose questions at any time, please use the Q&A tab, which on most Zoom screens will be at the bottom of your screen. Go ahead, type your questions there, and then I will pose them for our speaker at the end of his presentation. Thank you, and please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for your introduction and for your presentation, your invitation. It's a huge pleasure for me to participate in this webinar organized by the Center for Geopolitics and to be able to present my first monograph in front of an English-speaking audience. So my book, as you said, is entitled Kinmen, an archipelago between Taiwan and China. So in French, Kinmen, un archipel entre Taïwan et la Chine, and it has been published a few weeks ago by Carthala Press. It is based on my doctoral research in political science. I defended my thesis 2 years ago at the Paris Institute of Political Studies, Sciences Po, under the supervision of Françoise Mangin. That's why I'm an associate researcher at Sciences Po Center for International Studies. And since September 2023, I'm also a teaching and research fellow in Chinese studies at Bordeaux Montaigne University. Coming back to the inception of my doctoral research, which is also the inception of this book, I would like to start with this map of the Republic of China, which is the official name of the state we usually call Taiwan. I picked this one in particular, but many other maps depicting the territory of the Republic of China as of today are organized in the same manner. It is centered on the island of Taiwan, and in the upper left corner, you have two frames which include the archipelagos of Matsu on the top and Kinmen on the bottom. But if we put back these archipelagos at their real location, we notice that they are actually located on the other side of the Taiwan Strait, off the coast of the Chinese mainland. For my research, I decided to set Matsu aside and to focus exclusively on Kinmen for practical and epistemological reasons that I will touch upon later. So maps can be telling, but pictures can be even more. And at this point of my presentation, I would like to make sure that everyone is aware of the geographic proximity between Kinmen and the mainland city it faces across the inlet, Xiamen. So I took this first picture on the beach on Little Kinmen facing Xiamen. At the forefront, you can see anti-landing spikes, which are covered by water when the tide is high, in order to prevent the People's Liberation Army's tanks to invade the island. And in the back, you can see the shape of Xiamen skyscrapers. And I must admit that the view is even more impressive when you are there in person. Then if you cross the inlet and if you stand on Xiamen's beach, the view is less impressive because Little Kinmen is rather flat and there are no tall buildings to observe from afar. You can also see that there are no remnants of the Chinese Civil War, but rather a nice paving with white barriers to walk along the shore, passing by palm trees, which for most of them are in a better shape than the one I took a photograph of. And if you look closely, in the middle of the inlet, you can see the islet of Shiyu, which is controlled by Taipei and which hosts a few soldiers. Last picture here at Mashan observation post, which is where the distance between Kinmen and Xiamen is the shortest, a little bit less than 2 kilometers. So coming back to my research question, actually the mere fact of mentioning Kinmen, of taking Kinmen into consideration, forces us to recognize that political borders across the Taiwan Strait are not congruent with the median length of the Taiwan Strait. They do not superimpose with one another. In other words, there is a mismatch between the genuine political cartography of the Taiwan Strait that you can see here and its imagined cartography, an imagined cartography which is also actualized through maps such as this one published in Foreign Affairs back in June 2021. And if we put this mismatch in a diachronic perspective, if we take history into consideration, it appears that nothing had predestined Kinmen to be cut off from mainland China in 1949 in the context of the Chinese Civil War and to be governed from the other side of the Taiwan Strait. Indeed, Taiwan Island had only been integrated lately and loosely into the Chinese Empire in the 17th century, that is 1,000 years after Kinmen. 2 centuries later, in 1895, Taiwan Island had been ceded to Japan, so Taiwan became a Japanese colony, and it did not experience the fall of the Qing Empire in 1912, contrary to Kinmen. And as a consequence, it is the Republic of China which recovered Taiwan in 1945 after the Japanese surrender. So to sum up, being cut off from mainland China has rather been the norm in the history of Taiwan, but an exception in the history of Kinmen. Plus, nothing had predestined Kinmen to become what it is most famous for today, one of Chiang Kai-shek's last strongholds along the coast of mainland China. It served, during the Cold War, it served both as a frontline defense for Taiwan main island and as a potential stepping stone for Chiang Kai-shek's plan to recover the mainland. Twice in the 1950s, the shelling of Kinmen by the Chinese army, the People's Liberation Army, brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. And finally, nothing had predestined Kinmen to be part of a Republic of China, which since the early 1990s has democratized and Taiwanized. It has become a democratic Taiwanese nation state, although the primordial conception of the Taiwanese nation is supposed to exclude Kinmen based on so-called historical, geographic, and cultural determinisms. And that is why we can also talk of a mismatch between the borders of the Republic of China as a state and the limits of the Taiwanese imagined community. So in the end, the fact that the Republic of China has maintained its control over Kinmen up until today appears as a product of historical contingencies. So my object of study was, therefore, the meaning invested by actors in this product of historical contingencies. I decided to explore the place and the role assigned to Kinmen inhabitants, as well as the place and the role Kinmen inhabitants assigned to themselves within the framework of cross-strait relations since 1949. And here, cross-strait relations bear a double meaning, the classical one as the relations between the governments of Beijing and Taipei, but also as the relations between Taiwan main island and Kinmen within the Republic of China itself. This research goal seemed even more relevant to me that it enabled me to fill gaps in the existing academic literature. On the one hand, the trajectory of the Republic of China post 1949 has already been largely documented, but researchers always tend to adopt a Taiwan-centric approach, and they never elaborate on the specific case of Kinmen, Actually, in their works, the name of Kinmen is only mentioned at 3 main occasions: when the researcher makes a comprehensive list of the territories under Taipei's control, when they mention the 2 first Taiwan Strait crises in the 1950s, or when they mention the opening of direct links between Kinmen and Xiamen and between Matsu and Fuzhou in 2001, 7 years before the opening of direct links between Taiwan main island and mainland China. On the other hand, the academic literature on Kinmen suffers from 3 main limitations. First, the study of Kinmen is mostly focused on the Cold War era between 1949 and 1992. This is the case of the most famous book published in English about Kinmen, Michael Sony's Cold War Island, published in 2008. Second, the developments which happened on Kinmen during the Cold War are never rigorously put into perspective with what happened in Taiwan Island at that time. So in other words, the case of Kinmen is never reinjected in the trajectory and the transformations of the Republic of China as a whole. And third, Kinmen is never compared with other territories by researchers who do not design their study of Kinmen, as a case study. On a more general level, bearing these limitations in mind, and in order to make sure that my research contributes to political science in general, this has led me to study the extent to which the political or the political realm, in French we say le politique, can be constructed against any so-called geographic and historical determinisms. And in order to answer this research question, I didn't need to perform a rigorous comparison between the cases of Kinmen and Matsu, or to extensively exploit the specific case of Matsu. When comparison was needed, I preferred looking at territories across the globe beyond the Taiwan Strait. So apart from academic, semi-academic, and gray literature, I spent 12 months on the field in 2017-2018 between Kinmen, 8 months, Taipei, 3 months, and Xiamen, 1 month. I opted for ethnographic observation, interviews, 40 in total, and lots of informal discussion with locals. Therefore, it is the interweaving of these field sites, the considerations they raised, and the conclusions that shaped the final structure of this book, which is divided into 4 chapters. The first chapter examines the mismatch between the real political cartography and the imagined cartography of the Taiwan Strait, considering the Taiwan Strait as a political construct. In this chapter, I explore how actors and observers have come to consider the median lane of the Taiwan Strait as a dividing line of Chinese unity, despite the borders resulting from China's partition. In chapters 2 and 3, I then trace the historical modes of domination imposed on Kinmen from 1949 to the present day, focusing on 1992 as a turning point, the year martial law and military administration were lifted in Kinmen. The aim of these chapters is to capture the meaning the local population attributes to the territorial discontinuity of the state, and to examine the tactics and the strategies through which Kinmen's residents assert themselves as agents of their own history. And finally, in chapter 4, I build on the previous 2 chapters to propose a definition of Kinmen as a case study in political science, extending beyond the Taiwan Strait by questioning concepts and notions such as overseas territories, insularity, and the Foucauldian concept of heterotopia. So I do not have time to go through all of my 7 conclusions, so I will focus on 3 of them. First, conclusion number 1, focusing on the specific case of Kinmen enabled me to demonstrate that the Taiwan Strait articulates not one, but two sovereignty issues, which originally emerged in different spaces and timeframes. On the one hand, there is the question of which state is legitimate in representing the Chinese nation as a whole, the People's Republic of China, or the Republic of China. This issue arose from the 1949 partition of China, itself a result of the civil war between the Chinese Communist Party and the Kuomintang. And on the other hand, there is the question of whether Taiwan is part of the Chinese nation, regardless of which state holds legitimacy to represent the Chinese nation as a whole. This issue dates back to the February 28th massacre of 1947, during which the Taiwanese population rose up against Kuomintang's rule, barely a year and a half after Taiwan's return to China's sovereignty. It should be noted that in 1945, Chiang Kai-shek had decided to impose an exceptional administrative regime in the province of Taiwan, citing the consequences of the Japanese colonization on its population. And following the February 28th massacre, Taiwanese elites who managed to flee abroad began advocating for the establishment of an independent and sovereign Republic of Taiwan. However, these two issues have almost immediately become intertwined, if not conflated. First, because Chiang Kai-shek decided to make the island of Taiwan the fallback base of the Republic of China during the Civil War, a decision that was implemented in early December 1949. Second, because the United States deployed its 7th Fleet in the Taiwan Strait in June 1950 to contain communist expansion across Asia, basing this move on the theory of Taiwan's undetermined status under international law. Third, because the People's Republic of China gained international recognition, particularly from the 1970s onwards, enabling it to impose its own conception of a singular Taiwan issue. And finally, because of the Taiwanization of the Republic of China, which began in the 1990s. What matters here is that depending on how these two sovereignty issues or these two dimensions of the Taiwan issue interact, the case of Kinmen either becomes highly problematic, and as during the first two Taiwan Strait crises, or the case of Kinmen is rendered completely invisible, as it is usually the case. I would like also to take some time to expand on conclusion number 4, as it addresses most of the questions I've been asked in recent years. So today, as in the 1950s, the People's Republic of China likely has no intention of invading Kinmen without simultaneously planning an invasion of Taiwan proper. Mao Zedong himself articulated this strategy during the 1950s when he ordered the bombing of Kinmen without attempting to invade it. At the time, Mao aimed to leverage the United States' fear of direct involvement in an open conflict with the People's Republic of China and sought to push the US 7th Fleet out of the Taiwan Strait. Mao explicitly stated that invading Kinmen without also conquering the whole of Taiwan, as he puts it, was pointless. According to Mao, Kinmen under Chiang Kai-shek's rule served as a vital link between Taiwan Island and the Chinese mainland, and severing this link could have technically ended the Chinese Civil War, or at least the atmosphere of a civil war, since a cross-strait attack was impossible at that time. Both Mao Zedong and Chiang Kai-shek opposed this outcome, as it might have prompted the United States to raise the issue of Taiwan's undetermined status at the United Nations, And such a move could have resulted in Taiwan's removal from any Chinese sovereignty, the sovereignty exerted by the Republic of China, or the sovereignty claimed by the People's Republic of China. So this could have happened either through the creation of an independent Republic of Taiwan or the establishment of an international protectorate over the island. So even though the Cold War has ended and the international context has evolved, the PRC today still has no incentive to invade Kinmen without simultaneously targeting Taiwan Island. Beijing's interest in Kinmen remains exclusively tied to its relationship with Taiwan. So at the minimum, as a connection point between the mainland and Taiwan, and at the maximum as a potential tipping point for reunification. In this framework, Beijing has no reason to close this partially open door to the Taiwan Strait. And also from the perspective of Kinmen's residents, maintaining good relations with the mainland is not seen as a substitute for relations with Taiwan, but rather as a complement to them. The core concern is the well-being of Kinmen's population and the maximization of their quality of life. And notably, this pragmatic approach does not create tension over allegiance to either Beijing or Taipei. For example, during the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic, Kinmen residents supported Taipei's decision to suspend the direct links between Kinmen and Xiamen, showcasing their prioritization of public health over exchanges with the mainland. On the whole, if I wrap up the conclusions altogether, this study of Kinmen has led me to shed light on the mutual interaction between the political realm and so-called historical and geographic determinisms, and also to demonstrate how political societies can accept, reject, or build upon what is given by history and nature. And beyond the Taiwan Strait, similar dynamics can be observed in the case of overseas territories and their relationships with their homelands, or in the interactions between island territories and their respective mainlands. So thank you very much for your attention, and I will be very happy to hear your remarks and answer your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a fabulous presentation. Let me remind once again everyone in the audience, please to type your questions into the Q&A tab, and I can go ahead and feed those to our guest. First, I just have one interesting observation that I think is interesting. I don't know if it's an interesting observation, but this idea of kind of interstitial or liminal space between sovereignties. Honestly, I had never really thought about this systematically in the case of Kinmen. Even though I've been to Kinmen and spent time in Taiwan and in the mainland, in a sense, Kinmen is part of the mainland, but it's also part of the Republic of China's declared sovereignty and de facto sovereignty, rather than the People's Republic of China. So it's an interesting case in that it's sort of the Taiwan government's mainland appendage, so to speak, at least as I think you've conceptualized it. Is that an accurate way to think of it?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a very interesting point of view. So this, to me, the case of Kinmen is fascinating because as you said, it can be considered as part of the mainland in geographic terms, but at the same time, it is part of the Republic of China in political terms. And before 1949, and even before 1992, it was a complete anachronism, or it was even unthinkable to think about Kinmen as part of Taiwan, or Kinmen being called a Taiwanese territory. But since 1992, it has become more and more acceptable to talk about Kinmen in this way. Of course, there are still some debates of what is Taiwan? What are the borders of Taiwan? Is the ROC the equivalent of Taiwan? Depending on where you are located, if you are based on Taiwan main island or if you are based on Kinmen, the answer might not be the same. But for more and more Kinmen inhabitants, especially for the generation which was born after 1992, it's becoming more and more acceptable to consider themselves as Taiwanese or to consider that Kinmen is part of Taiwan.
Yeah, I mean, it also sort of throws open this other interesting set of cases just within the Taiwan Strait context. As you pointed out at the beginning from the map, right? We have also Matsu and Penghu Islands and all these other islands that are at various points in the strait. Um, does it actually make a difference? I guess one way that I would phrase the question would be, does it actually make a difference if we're talking about geography or politics? Isn't politics more important when if our concern is indeed this kind of competition between sovereignties or competition between states? Um, you know, do people in Zinmen, for example, care more that they are a mainland island controlled by a government in Taiwan, or do they care more about the fact that they are under the sovereignty of the Republic of China as stroke Taiwan rather than the mainland?
So actually, it always depends on the context of the discussion that you may have with the people of Jinmen. Of course, what matters most to them is that they are part of the ROC and the capital city of the ROC being Taipei. So yes, but then depending on the context, they might distance themselves from Taiwan, or at least from the term Taiwan, saying that Taiwan is reserved to Taiwan Island. But sometimes, if we are talking about the dialectic between Taiwan and the mainland, they would say that they are part of Taiwan, because we are opposing two political regimes. When it comes to geography, then they might say that the mainland that they refer to is the Chinese mainland. When they are talking about the construction of their insularity, they are referring to mainland China as their mainland. But depending on the context, but there's also a law in the Republic of China, which is called the Offshore Islands Development Act. And then the insularity of Jinmen is defined regarding Taiwan Island. So depending on the context, of course, that was at the very beginning of my research. My research question was the relationship between politics and geography, and maybe there is a primacy of one over the other. But in the end, there is really this issue of a mutual interaction, and politics might build upon geography and geographic, some form of geographic determinism.
Yeah, I guess I'll ask one more little follow-up question on this, and then we do have a couple questions coming in now from the audience that I'll start to pose. But the one little follow-up would be, you sort of teased at this idea of extending the argument to other cases. I mean, the one that immediately sprung to my mind as you said that was Jersey. And so, I mean, there we have an island which is basically part of mainland Europe, is far closer to France than it is to Britain, yet defines its sort of insular status both ways somewhat, but really more with reference to Britain, I would say, as its mainland, quote unquote, even though it's right next to the mainland of France. Would that be a sort of viable comparison case or analogous case in some ways?
That's actually, I thought of the Channel Islands at some point during my thesis. I decided to dive into the case of French overseas territories because it was easier for me. But yeah, that could be an interesting point of comparison. At least when I talk about comparison, I'm not trying to find, of course, you have to find some common ground, but what matters in the end is the differences between these points of comparison. So I used the case of the French overseas territories to try to understand the specific case of Jinmen and how it could relate to other territories across the globe. But in the end, what differentiates the case of Jinmen from that of the French overseas territories and maybe other overseas territories is that in the case of overseas territories, you have this kind of alternative between being independent or being an integral part, being completely integrated into the state. And in the case of Jinmen, the alternative is being of course, on the one hand, you have this possible solution, which is a complete integration into the ROC. And on the other, it's not in the independence of Kinmen, but reunification with the PRC.
Right. Okay, let me start with some of the audience questions then as well. So the first one that we have, the questioner says, can you explain your choice to focus on Jinmen instead of Mazu? And to what extent is Mazu's situation analogous to Jinmen or not? And what other geopolitical situations around the world are analogous to the Jinmen situation? And what lessons can we learn from them that would help us understand the case of Jinmen better?
Okay, thank you very much, Ian, for your question. So I guess I already kind of answered to the second part of your question, but when it comes to the choice of focusing on Jinmen rather than Mazu, actually before my PhD, I did some research for my master's thesis where I did a comparison between Jinmen and Mazu in terms of Taiwanese identity. That's what the concept I used at that time. So I did some field work in Mazu. And before going on field work, I thought that the case of Kinmen and Mazu were completely comparable with one another. So I first went to Kinmen, and 2 weeks later, I went to Mazu, and I was really surprised to discover that the situations were not the same. In terms of geography, first, Matsu, is way smaller than Kinmen. It's only something like less than 30 square kilometers, and Kinmen is 150. There are less inhabitants also, and the archipelago of Matsu is the 5 main islands that compose the archipelago of Matsu are at a distance of, at maximum, something like 80 kilometers away from one another. So even when we talk about Matsu as a whole, actually there are different historical trajectories within the islands composing the Matsu archipelago. And at the same time, it was also a choice regarding their respective historical trajectories. It was a little bit heartbreaking to set Matsu aside, but in the end, when you look at the historical trajectory of Matsu and Kinmen before 1949, the historical trajectory of Kinmen is richer than that of Matsu. And after 1949, the historical trajectory of Kinmen has been more, how could I say that? More things happen in Kinmen than in Matsu, actually. So there's this idea from the West that Kinmen and Matsu could not be separated with one another. There's this idea of a Kinmen-Matsu duet, Quemoy and Matsu. But actually, it's the Chinese partition and the Cold War that created this duet. But if you look closely at these two cases, you realize or you become aware that these two archipelagos are actually in two different situations.
Okay, so now we've got a somewhat provocative question from another audience member who asks, first of all, says, thank you very much for a very insightful presentation, and then goes on to ask, would you share some thoughts on how likely the PRC is to launch an invasion on Taiwan, which, based on your research, will likely also include Jinmen, especially with talk regarding a potential invasion in 2027 and a new American administration under Trump?
So these questions comes really often, actually, after presentations about Taiwan. When it comes to the date of 2027, it must be said that over the past few years, there has been so many dates that have been given for a potential invasion of Taiwan by the PRC. Some even talked about 2021 for the 100th anniversary of the CCP. Even in 2020, there were rumors of a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan due to the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that the countries were already focused on something else, especially the US, and even in the context of the US presidential election. So it comes really often. The thing is that the PRC is more and more ready for an invasion, yes, but when will it happen? We cannot absolutely be sure about this, if it happens at all, because there are all other scenarios than an invasion, an amphibious landing of PRC troops on Taiwan. And when it comes to the Trump administration, well, we don't really know what could happen either. You know, Trump has been known for being one of the last most Taiwan-friendly US presidents over the past decades, but we're not absolutely sure what we can expect from him on the Taiwan issue and on other issues as well.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one interesting angle to this question, rather than even trying to predict sort of when there might be an invasion, which I agree with you, and this is something of a fool's errand. I mean, it's there's always this risk, but I don't know if the risk is going up or down, or exactly when the risk will go up or down. But if we think about Kinmen and its position vis-a-vis Taiwan, the main island of Taiwan, in the context of potential military action. I mean, I think there is a consensus in Taiwan and in the mainland of China, actually, that Jinmen is probably not defensible, right? That it's if any of the territories held by the Taiwan government, it is probably the least defensible, or
Yeah.
at least of the ones that would be really valuable. Mazu arguably is less defensible, but also less valuable, and so how do people in G-Men react to this? Because I think one of the things that really illuminates your work over most others that I've seen on G-Men, and I think it's true, there's been very little scholarship really on G-Men, far less than I think it deserves, is this ethnographic component. And so I'm sure this must come up. I mean, what does it feel like for people? How do they perceive this political and social reality of being inhabitants of an indefensible territory?
Yeah, thank you so much for this question because it's a very interesting question. Actually, before going to Jinmen for my first fieldwork, I thought from Paris, you know, that Jinmen inhabitants must feel torn apart between Taipei and Beijing, and that they must live in a constant state of fear because of a potential invasion, being so close to the Chinese mainland and being almost indefensible from a Taiwanese point of view. But then I was really surprised when I went to Jinmen and I could discuss and have chats with the local people, because in the end, this idea of being on the front line has existed since 1949. And now the people of Jinmen are absolutely aware of the situation. But if they think about it all the time, every day, they cannot live at all. They cannot live in a constant fear of being invaded and of risking to be, abandoned into the hands of the PRC. So in the end, in their everyday life and in their daily lives, this question does not arise that often. Of course, when you are walking along the shore of Jinmen, when you are looking at the buildings of Xiamen, you can think about the potential invasion that could happen. But it's not something that people think about all the time. Their daily lives, they manage to run their daily lives also outside of this perspective of an invasion.
Yeah. So I mean, another interesting sort of angle to this would be how does this change over time, right? Because if I think back to, just what I know from secondary sources, I've done no primary research on this myself, but, you know, in the 1950s, I think that it was that sort of fear would be inescapable, but maybe even not as much fear because of the sense that the invasion was less possible or is less likely to succeed, but there's active shelling going on. And then
Yeah,
after 1958, once it settles into a sort of regularized pattern of shelling for the
yeah,
next, 35 years or so, that must make things feel a little bit more routinized.
yeah. Absolutely. So that's something that I didn't mention in my presentation, but between 1958 and late 1978, Jinmen was bombed every other day by the PLA. So it was called the Danda Shuangguda, so shelling on the odd days and not shelling on the even days.
Mm.
And in return, the ROC army shelled Xiamen the other days. So yeah, there was this kind of routine in the shelling, and even the shells that were sent to Kinmen, the bombs were not explosive bombs. Actually, they were filled with propaganda leaflets, with like photographs of the mainland, packs of cigarettes, propaganda, communist propaganda, etc., etc. So there, and the people of Jinmen were trained. All of the civilians were part of a militia, and they were trained in order to know how to react in case of a Chinese invasion. So that was actually, yeah, part of their daily lives. There was a curfew. They could not escape all of the military infrastructure, the heavy presence of soldiers on the island. So in this sense, yeah, this was pretty unescapable. But at the same time, it did not prevent them to think outside of the risk of the invasion, even though there was an attempt to completely capture the Jimenez individuals into this paradigm of the civil war and into this prospect of a future invasion. It hasn't completely deprived them from the ability of continuing to meeting with people of their lineage, or it didn't erase any form of social interaction outside of this risk of an invasion.
Yeah, I mean, I think an interesting example of that even is the practice of using metal from those shells to create works of art and all kinds of other, everyday implements and things like this. I mean, is that an example of this kind of bending the exceptional to the quotidian, or
Yeah,
are there other examples too that maybe are lesser known?
yeah. So this is maybe one of the most famous examples. The fact that from the shells, some people in Jinmen began making knives even during the 1950s. Yeah, indeed. And now this fabric still exists. And if you go to Jinmen, you can bring back a knife from the shells which fell on Jinmen during the Cold War. So this is one of the tactics. But there were also other ones, and especially with people of the lineage, because even if um, even if there was a special administrative regime set up in Jinmen, which was called the War Zone Administration, and even if all of the decisions were supposed to be taken in the War Zone Administration Committee, there were still temples where the people met, and the officers and the people ruling, the administrators, went to consult the heads of the different lineage, and that was still part of the social organization in Jinmen at that time. And even at that time, during the Cultural Revolution, there was also another movement that Chiang Kai-shek implemented in response to the Cultural Revolution on the mainland, which was the cultural, I don't remember, cultural Renaissance movement, something like that. And the lineages in Jinmen were incited to create associations, Zongqinhui. And these Zongqinhui have become political entrepreneurs, actually political enterprises in the framework of the democratization of Jinmen.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of democratization, actually, that's another angle then to think of some of this. Let's imagine that in contrast to the question that was posed just now from the member in the audience, let's sort of think about what if there is no invasion imminent, but rather a deepening of democratization or a strengthening even of Taiwan sovereignty, such that the relationship between Kinmen and the main island of Taiwan could be rearticulated in some way or adjusted in some way. How would that actually play out? Is there a strong pressure for greater autonomy or greater integration or some kind of a new arrangement, or is that just not really even on the agenda at all?
So there's an issue here. Yeah. Actually, it's been almost since the 1990s, since the martial law and the military administration have been lifted in Kinmen, that there has been debate on the possibility of implementing something like a special administrative region of Kinmen. The first time it occurred, it was something like 1994, in order to help Jinmen in the process of democratization. The fact is that the central government has always delayed the potential implementation of such a special administrative region because it would lead to the lift of specific or the adoption of specific regulations towards Jinmen. And if a special administrative region would be implemented, it would probably mean a deepening of the links between Jinmen and the mainland, and potentially paving the way for a potential small unification between Jinmen and the mainland. So that's why it has always been rejected by Taipei's central government.
Which is really interesting because in a sense it's almost a mirror image logic of sort of rationales for impeding other areas of democratization or governance reform. And that, very often the fear in the 1990s, certainly, or even earlier in Taiwan, was that too much democracy or too much reform of governance might lead to an upsurge in pushing for Taiwan independence, right? Or things like this. Whereas in the Jinmen case, it really does sound like what the fear is that too much democracy or too much autonomy for Jinmen could be actually leading to a surge in sentiments for unification with mainland China in Jinmen, that this could occur.
Yeah, but I don't know if the implementation of such a special administrative region would fuel a pro-unification sentiment among the people of Jinmen, actually.
Right.
One thing is very sure, because I met many people in Jinmen, and among all of the people that I met, there was only one single individual who told me that he was in favor of a unification with the PRC. There is a very clear red line when it comes to the issue of unification. And when you talk with people in Jinmen asking about the relationship with the mainland, the most frequent answer is that we should put the politics aside and we should not talk about unification or one country, two systems or whatsoever. What's important is the well-being of the people of Kinmen and the fact that we should maintain good relations with the mainland. Of course, it seems rather idealistic to think that you can put the political dimension of this issue aside, especially since that's absolutely not the case for the CCP and for the People's Republic of China. There's always this issue of political negotiations and at least a reunification in mind. But for the people in Jinmen, there is still, at least for now, a red line when it comes to the state they belong to or the state they want to belong to. It's always the Republic of China.
Right. But let me at this point ask once again if anyone in the audience has further questions, please to go ahead and type those into the Q&A tab. I'd be more than happy to feed those along if any do come in. I guess the other thing then that I'll do is invite you, Alex, if you have something to say beyond what's already been said that we haven't gotten to, like if there's any area you want to sort of return to and speak a bit more about, or if we've left anything out from the discussion.
Yeah, there's maybe one point that I'd like to insist on.
Mm-hmm.
So over the past few years after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, people have tended to be more and more interested in Kinmen. People have tended to make comparisons between Kinmen and the Crimea, etc. With this work and with my research, I really tried to show that Kinmen is not limited to a geopolitical flashpoint. There's something beyond geopolitics and relations of power across the strait or the international stage. Jinmen is a place where there are inhabitants, there are people living, there are people who have their daily lives, and this is something that should not be completely disregarded, you know. And I really wanted to show that even though there are tensions across the strait or international tensions, and that the case of Jinmen sometimes arises, sometimes it's completely forgotten, there are people living there permanently, and I wanted to show this interaction between huge geopolitical issues and the very daily lives of the people there.
Wonderful. Let me invite you to do one more thing very quickly, and then there are two more questions that have just come in, and maybe more coming. But the one thing I'll invite you to do very quickly is just to speak a little bit more, actually, about the contours of that Jinmen community, right? Who are these people who live in Jinmen permanently? What do they do? What kind of economy and society exists there? For many in the audience who probably don't know. And actually, even though I've been there, I don't really know.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So officially, Jinmen is inhabited by something like more than 130,000 inhabitants, but in fact, there are only 50 to 60,000 people living there permanently. Most of them are elderly people or very young people, actually, because the young adults and adults in general go either to Taiwan or to Taiwan Island or to mainland China, most of them to Taiwan to find a job, and come back there from time to time, and especially during election time. The thing is, now the economy of Jinmen is mostly based on tourism and also on agriculture. And when I'm talking about agriculture, I'm also talking about the Jimen Gaoliang, so Gaoliang Jiu, the liquor, sorghum liquor that is produced in Jinmen, and which belongs to the distillery belongs to the county administration, the county government, and the revenue the of this liquor enables the Jinmen County government to implement a very generous welfare system. So most of the people on Jinmen are either public servants or work in the agriculture or in the tourism sector.
Okay. Now let me give you these couple of actually one very quick follow-up from me, and then I'll give you the two from the audience. You said that people return to G-Men often to vote in elections. How do they usually vote? Is there a dominant party in G-Men? Is this something that there's all over the map, or
Yeah,
the
so
divisions?
the Kuomintang is still the very dominant party there. The DPP really struggles to find its place in Jinmen because it has been created outside of Jinmen without taking Jinmen into consideration.
Hmm.
Because it's the product of the Dangwai movement, which was limited to Taiwan Island. So Jinmen was not an issue. And yeah, so up until 2018, the scores of the DPP were slowly rising, but then the main figure of the DPP in Jinmen left the party, and since then it's really hard for the DPP to gain votes in Jinmen. But even more importantly, what matters most when it comes to the vote of the people of Jinmen is not the party, it's rather the lineage and the clan and the family name of the people. There's a saying in Jinmen that there are three main political parties in Jinmen: the Chen party, the Li party, and then the Kuomintang. Because the Chen and the Li are the most common family names in Jinmen.
Right. Okay. So I'll give you actually the audience questions now in reverse order. So the first, i.e., the last one to come in, asks the most important question: colon, when is the English version of your book coming out?
I'd like to have an answer for this.
Hmm.
So it's a plan, yeah, to have it translated and published in English, but for now, nothing is carved in stone. So we'll see.
And then the other is, what are the attitudes of people on Taiwan Island, politicians and ordinary people towards Jinmen?
Well, actually, it really depends on the people. The fact is that most of the people of Jinmen would say that the people on Taiwan do not consider them enough, and they are not taken into consideration enough. There are still many misconceptions of Jinmen from the perspective of Taiwan people on Taiwan Island. I remember one of my Taiwanese friends when I told her that I wanted to study Jinmen, and she told me that it was still a war zone and that I shouldn't go there, etc. And yeah, most of the time, people in on Taiwan Island are not aware enough of what the situation is in Jinmen, and they don't know really much about Jinmen, especially because it's not really part of their history or geography classes, apart from mentioning the Battle of Guningtou in 1949 and the two first Taiwan Strait crises. One interesting thing is that during the Cold War, during doing your military service in Jinmen was something that was really feared by the young Taiwanese men. But now Jinmen has become one of the favorite destinations for young Taiwanese people to do their military service because it's far away from the mainland of Taiwan. Is the occasion to go a little bit somewhere else in a nice small island. So this is really something striking when it comes to a shift in representations about Jinmen from the point of view of Taiwanese people.
Yeah, that is quite interesting. And if I think to the Cold War in terms of the military presence, the other key image that always comes into my mind is that of defectors and refugees, right? I mean, many famous cases of people sort of swimming from Xiamen into Jinmen, well-known public figures, intellectuals, artists, etc., as well as ordinary soldiers, and at least one or two high-profile cases of people who went the other way, right? People doing military service in the ROC military in Jinmen who actually defected to the mainland by doing the same swim in reverse. How does that politics play? I mean, would you talk just a little bit about that scenario as well?
So about the potential the crossing of the inlet, right, or the refugee.
Yeah, yeah, both during the Cold War, but also today. Is that still a thing? Does anybody actually do that, or is that really a relic of the 1960s to 1980s?
So as of today, if we're talking about today, there are like swimming competitions between Kinmen and Xiamen.
Yeah.
So crossing the inlet has not the same political implications, or at least depending on the context. Because, for instance, during the last military exercises, the last military drills of the PLA last month, Jinmen was supposedly not concerned by these drills, but actually on the 14th of October, so on the day of the drills, there has been a Chinese citizen that has been caught landing on a small islet which belongs to Jinmen County. So there are still attempts, not from the point of refugees sometimes, or people saying that they are trying to seek refuge in Taiwan, but also that can be part of so-called gray zone activities by the PRC. Yeah.
Okay, so it looks like our audience has exhausted their curiosity by asking questions. I've had a chance to ask you lots of questions. Was there anything else at all that you'd like to say in conclusion?
So for me, I think I managed to touch upon all of the issues that I wanted to talk about.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. And thank you, everyone in the audience, for your attention and wonderful questions. Thanks.
Thanks to you. Thank you very much. And thanks to all of you.
Thanks.